All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. All right, today I get a chance to talk to somebody that I have interacted with a lot over the last, decade and a half, maybe, something like that. His name's Chris Coleman. He's a professor at University of Denver. He is in the what is the department now called, actually?
Emergent Digital Practices.
That's right, EDP, right. It's digital media studies when I was there, but nevertheless, it is sort of like the digital end of art. It's a fabulous thing, and Chris has always been kind of on the bleeding edge of software in art in technology. So he's a perfect person for us to talk to on this podcast. So thanks a lot, Chris, for joining us. Why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about what your current work is?
Okay. I'm currently working on a number of fronts. I'm doing a lot of things with digital fabrication, thinking about what it means to go from the digital back into the physical. And that involves a number of processes, but I just got a new CNC machine. I'm spinning that up over the Christmas break. I'm doing a lot of work with photogrammetry, where you take lots of photographs and turn them into 3D models, and then subsequently turn that information into 3D models for animation and motion graphic works. Really, mostly working in terms of like landscapes and nature, and thinking about the ways that we construct and decode and control nature and natural spaces is one of the areas I'm thinking about. And the digital fabrication work I'm working on that I mentioned is conceptually, I'm thinking a lot about labor and how we monetize labor and how we value labor or don't value labor and different kinds of labor. And then another huge chunk of my time at the moment is taken up directing something I made a couple years ago called the Clinic for Open Source Arts, which is a nonprofit organization focused on the health of open source tools for creative use.
That sounds amazing. I see already you've given me like 3 hours worth of questions just with that, and we've got freaking 45 minutes. So, sorry, listeners. You're gonna see me jumping all over the map. But let's start with the back end of that. This Clinic for Open Source Arts. Can you expand on that a little bit? I think everyone that listens to this is in some way interacting with open source art making tools. And I'm wondering, when you talk about making it, I don't know what was the phrase you used, but making it like a vital place for creatives to work. What does that mean? What does that actually look like in practical terms?
Yeah, COSA came out of my efforts realizing that, a full professor at a nonprofit but well-off institution was indebted to the tools that we use in our classroom, and trying to figure out how do we give back to the communities. Every time we teach a class with processing or Bitsy or like any of these big or small tools, Blender, how are we making sure that we're an additive part of that community? And so I was originally just doing smaller actions, inviting the processing team out to develop. They actually developed version 3 using our spaces as a sort of like developer hub for a week.
Okay.
And doing some things for open frameworks and other projects. And so from there, escalating that to creating an organization, thinking about the big picture issues of sustainability. I think we have a real issue with projects that get spun up and they start to get used, and there's a sort of disconnect between, there's lots of that discussion of like, is it free as in mattress on the curb? Is it free as in like all the different kinds of ways that things are free, and all the different kinds of ways that we think about open source and how it can be helpful and how do we feed back into that. And so, yeah, that notion of sustainability and health, like thinking deeply about the community around a tool and not just the tool is code and are there people helping make the code, but it's really about like, what does a community look like around a tool and how does the community engage with code and the people developing code. And I think learning a lot from Lauren McCarthy and her work on defining contribution with the P5JS project,
Right.
um, really deeply thinking about like everybody that makes a tutorial or everybody that even like advocates for using P5JS is a contributor. And so once you start to expand that notion, you start to think about how everybody is a part of this living thing called an open source tool for the arts.
Right. Yeah. That's awesome. Now, the other two things you talked about, the digital fabrication and the photogrammetry, it seems like those are like opposing forces, right? One, you're trying to take the physical and turning it digital. The other, you're taking the digital and turning it physical. Now, it's actually funny for me to. As long as I've known you, you've been involved in like robotics and microprocessors. You're the first person I saw that actually, embraced the whole 3D printer thing. Even when it was kind of a mess, you were still in there taking a swing at it, and it was really interesting to watch. But also, it was one of those things that was kind of surprising to me because at the time there was really this desire to collapse everything into digital, and I know. Just I would have discussions. I mean, one of the things with working in and around the university, you always get like curious people with big checkbooks wandering around asking questions, right? And what was hilarious to me is the number of people that as soon as you started talking about something that was a physical entity, they clicked off, walked out the door with their checkbook. They didn't want to hear about it because somehow that like violated some kind of venture capitalist rule 101, right? But I think it's interesting that it continues. It's one of those things I swear like every day I see some kind of little thing pass along on Instagram or something. It's like, oh, here's the world's largest 3D printed boat, right? Or, oh, these people 3D printed their interior for their RV or something like that, right? It's like there's this like constant thing because there's excitement about being able to do it, but also there's an indicator that it's becoming a lot more viable for things that we would actually really use.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I'm part of the NFT scene right now, and that's also a huge conversation. This notion of physical primacy and digital primacy, and the notion that like finally we can collect all the art, and we only have to have space on a hard drive, and you don't have to have a big house, and that like somehow that's a different kind of democratizing. But I'm over here busy like buying physical art just
Yeah.
as much as I'm buying NFT art. So it's a pretty intense conversation. I literally just bought a print of an NFT piece today just because I was like, I want to live with this. It's not about putting it in my cyber house sometime in the future. Like I want to live with it in the now. So
Your cyber house. You, in fact, are the person I think of that would be the first person with a cyber house, too. For that matter. So there's that. Well, this is really interesting, and I actually want to get into NFTs a little bit more in a bit. But before we do that, one of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their background, how they got to be the artists that they are. What were the influences that both artistic and technological? Because that is the shtick behind this podcast is talking to people that have feet in both, technology and art. I'm curious what came out, what was the thing that like drove you into each of those, and maybe who are some of the people that also influenced you on the way?
goodness. So I have always been a really creative child, but my father, stepfather, grandfather, and more were all engineers. And so I was raised, and I'm very comfortable in like 3D and physics. And so for me, there was a sort of comfortable space in both worlds growing up, but it was obvious that like there was no such thing as a job in art. And so you
Hmm.
went to school for engineering, as people do. I thought I would be able to be a creative engineer, like designing toys and roller coasters and cool stuff. And then I met somebody who graduated the year before me, and they explained that their job was to engineer and re-engineer the hook on the end of a Venetian rod that closes blinds, and that was his literal 9 to 5 job. And that was literally the moment I dropped
You
out of
bailed.
school. Yeah, I quit my mechanical engineering major with 6 credits to go, and did a little bit of a reset because I realized that I wasn't so good that I was going to be some superstar engineer and get those cool jobs. And so I went back to school for art after that, and I've been bringing stuff together ever since. Especially when I went to SUNY Buffalo, where I was in both the art department and the media studies department there, and working with really just some fantastic artists and being exposed to all the artists I'd just never known before. But I think a lot of my professors came out of Carnegie Mellon and some of the ideas around the Sub Rosa, which is a cyber feminism group. Faith Wilding headed up that, but Lale was also a part of that. And the Critical Art Ensemble. So a number of members of that were also professors or people adjacent to the Critical Art Ensemble. And Paul Van Els was my primary sort of advisor in that regard, teaching me electronics. At that point, they were just exposing me to so many amazing people. Also, I had a really early, one of my earliest digital teachers was Hassan Alahi, who actually taught for like 15 weeks at West Virginia University as one of his first jobs before he got flagged by the FBI and everything. And so that was a really interesting and early connection in a very small world of digital artists.
Well, that's really interesting, and I mean, SUNY Buffalo and kind of the academic world surrounding Buffalo just has this long history of media art stuff, and so that has to be kind of a rich environment to let your mind grow as well.
It was. I mean, Tony Conrad was there, pushing boundaries, even at his age at that point. But every single person there was really on the edge of a lot of things. I actually was learning VR in 2002 there, in a programming language called Yggdrasil, with Dave Pope, I guess. I don't remember his last name now, but he sort of designed the VR language. So yeah, it was like super edgy stuff at that point.
Right, right. Amazing, amazing. Now, so you came out of that. How did you get into academics? Was there like any kind of a period of like professional stuff, or did you just keep on working your way through the academic system?
I quickly learned that one of the things that I love to do is to share knowledge with people. And despite being an introvert, I discovered a sort of space where I could put on a performance and use my love for sharing and generating ideas with other people, like sort of co-brainstorming. And I feel like those are two like great skills for a teacher. And I started to understand that those two things kept me excited about teaching, but also the piece that I was constantly having to relearn and learn new things. I think maybe those three things together, constantly wanting to learn myself, constantly like loving to help other people learn and share things with them, and brainstorming, that really comes together quite well. I did have one of those moments where I was offered a really great job doing motion graphics in New York City, and just sort of like path in the
Right.
path in the past where I could have gone to one direction or the other, and I decided to stay with the academy at that point.
I was wondering because in the time frame that you were coming through, I was assuming that there would have been those moments where, someone dangled a job offer because the combination skill set that you would have had was relatively rare at a time that those things, or at least the exploration into those things, was kind of exploding.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was fortunate. Everybody was spinning up digital programs. Buffalo was such a rare bird at that point.
Right.
And yeah, I got lots of job offers. It was a really interesting time to be on the market and talking to people. And there were other people who had a lot of technical knowledge, but not a lot of people who also brought the sort of critical voice to their work.
Right.
There was lots of like, I'm a technician making beautiful things, and then there were, and I had people tell me that I was a rarity because I brought both of those things together.
Hmm. So, in what I mean, the way that you bring sort of like that the critical view into play, though, that can come in a lot of different ways. For you, how did it how did it manifest itself? What were the ways that you brought critique, social critique, environmental criticism, whatever? How did you bring those into your work?
You know, I think probably the most powerful stuff happened through a lot of my motion graphic animated work, where I was reusing propaganda pamphlets that came out of 9/11 and terrorism readiness stuff. And I was combining that a lot with old illustrations from Boy Scout and Girl Scout manuals in the 50s and earlier, and thinking about like how we're trained and taught to do certain things certain ways, and how to twist that kind of training around to instead talk about issues of borders and nationalism and the ways that we treat other people the moment we call them an other, and try and define them as different because they live on the other side of an invisible line. And so I was really making a lot of work that tackled these issues. And I think one of the hardest things for me to do is had to transition from purely making work that really took these things on in a pretty angry and disturbed way. Like I wanted you to know that this was a problem,
Right.
and and I think I've really been trying to spend the last decade retraining myself to not just point out problems, but start to point to solutions. And what does it mean to move forward? How can we think about options for being constructive and finding a future that we want to exist in together? And that's a much bigger challenge than just sort of pointing out the things that are wrong. So it's been a joy, but also like a real impediment to making quick art, because you've got to be much more thoughtful in a way.
Sure. Yeah. Now, what was your path to actually becoming to professorship? I mean, were you an instructor at schools before DU, or was that your first place?
Yeah, immediately after
I'm
grad.
surprised I don't know this. I've known you
No, it's
forever, and I'm
okay.
surprised I don't know these answers.
It's a typical academic story, which is like, right out of grad school, I was lucky because I had a full-time 1 year gig at SUNY Fredonia, about an hour south of Buffalo.
Right.
And then I had a 1 year full-time gig at St. Cloud State University in northern
Oh,
Minnesota.
yeah. It's just down the road from me now. Yeah.
Yeah, where it's very cold.
Very cool.
And they tried to get me to stay, but and they were amazing people. Like it was one of the, sometimes you encounter faculty and they're really a great group of people and they get along together. And it was a great experience, but man, it was cold up there. And so then I got a tenure track job out at University of Oregon in Eugene,
Oh, okay.
and I did that for a couple of years. And that's a great program, their digital arts program. And I probably would have left except for I started seeing my now wife, Lale Mehran, and we went on the spouse job hunt together and ended up here in Denver.
Well, congratulations for that. That's one of the things that often is really hard for couples that are both academics, is being able to find work together. Now, you actually do artwork with Lolly as well, right?
That's true. We were collaborators before we were romantically involved.
Oh, really? Oh, that's cool.
Because she went to graduate school at Carnegie Mellon as well, and was in the sort of Pittsburgh, Morgantown area where I went to school in West Virginia. And so the digital art world at that time again was fairly small.
Right.
And we had done some early collaborations. We made a sort of security rave called M House, where you had to give up all your social security numbers and other personal information in order to get into the rave. And we used like dozens of security cameras to show people what they were doing, and it was like a fun fascist rave, I suppose.
Sure. All right, I've got to write that down. Fun fascist rave. That's a new phrase for this podcast, my friend.
But yeah, we've been working together ever since on large and small scale projects, and then I also serve as a technical producer for some of her artworks, and that's always an interesting like understanding when we're doing a collaboration and when I'm working for her as an assistant. So
That's really that's I wouldn't have even thought about having to make that definition, but I'm sure it becomes a really important, in a lot of ways, not only for how you get along working with each other on various projects, but also how whoever's showing the work, how they want to be able to portray it or talk about it or whatever. So that's interesting. I literally hadn't thought about that. That's cool. Um, so now let's talk a little bit about go back to kind of some of these technological things that you talked about, because again, you were, I knew people who had played around with Arduinos before I met you, but you were the person that I knew that kind of like embraced it. Similarly with other sort of like what I would say is artful technologies. You're always kind of on the forefront of that. What what is it about you that why do you seek that stuff out? Why is tracking that important to you?
that's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever thought of
Well,
it.
because a lot of people, when they finally find something that they enjoy and are good at,
Hmm.
they really want to just sort of like block everything out, and which means that you can make a really bright thing of it, but also it may just kind of peter out on you too. I feel like you have, when I watch you, it's almost when I watched you, it was almost like you had this innate desire to like latch onto things and check out the new stuff and try out different things. And I thought that I didn't know if there was something about doing that you had kind of identified for yourself, or but it's a really interesting, it's one of the ways I think of you, right?
I appreciate that actually. I've always been, I grew up as the child who took every toy apart to understand how it worked
Okay.
and managing to put most of them back together. So yeah, I think in many ways I'm always trying to do the same thing. Like I've got about a dozen small projects here in the lab that that I should bring to more of a finish. But I really like that process of like being curious about how far you can push something and trying that out and pushing it around and then just having that sit there for you until you find the project that needs that capability. And so like, I just bought a Jetson Nano from NVIDIA because I was like, okay, a $60 thing that has a GPU. Like I'm really interested not in using it for AI. I'm not really into the AI scene, but I'm interested in using it for shaders. And so I was just like running different artwork shader tests on it to see how far we could push it before the fan kicked in and before the frame rate just went to shit. And so, and now I've put that away and like I may or may not use it again. And I've got a whole drawer full of microcontrollers and other devices that I may or may not use again. But like until I do, because, the Jetson Nanos advertise for a certain thing, but I suspected it could be used for other things. And so when I or another artist or a student wants to do something, I can say, hey, actually, I know what you could use for that.
Yeah, that's actually really really compelling, and it does seem like it's more than just knowing that something exists. It's also having had the experience. So you can not
Yeah.
only say, this might be something that you could use, but also it's like, but if you try, make sure that you think about this potential, road bump or speed bump or whatever. Yeah, that's really cool. Now, the other thing, and you mentioned it during our first segment, you mentioned that you were involved in getting both NFTs as well as physical stuff, and in the NFT thing, it's talk about something that was like that was like a flash fire, right? I remember I was talking to a friend of mine in San Francisco one day, and he was like, yeah, blah 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 NFTs, and I'm like, what's an NFT? And he's like, non-fungible token. It's this thing, and you can do art, la la la. And I'm like, well, I never heard of that before. Like literally the next day, I heard it on CNN, and the day after that, I hear it. I'm obsessed with listening to Squawk Box, which is just all these talking heads talking about stocks. I don't invest in stocks for some reason. I'm just fascinated by them talking, and they're talking about NFTs. Like 2 days later, it ramped up that fast, and I just couldn't believe it. But now I don't know that we as the collective body of artists, and especially my kind of crew, which tends to focus on sound art and music, I'm not sure that there's a real understanding of NFTs. I think right now, if you took an average person and said, NFTs, have you heard of them? If they say yes, it'll be like, yeah, some dude sold a GIF for $20 million. That's the extent of what they know about it. And first of all, it's pretty clear that this isn't just an option to sell gifts for $20 million, right?
Right.
There's something else going on there. But I'm wondering how, as a person who's involved in technology and art, as a person who works with a lot of artists, and as well as a lot of technologists, what does NFTs hold that is of value to us as a community of artists and a community of artists, art technologists?
First and foremost, it's a pretty straightforward way for people like me to collect work from other artists, whether they be audio or video or GIF or still images or photographers, anything that can be a digital file. I've been trying to be an art collector. I'm not rich, so I'm not buying, big name stuff. But I've been trying to collect art from digital artists for more than a decade, and it has just become 1,000 times easier. I'm not dealing with galleries. I'm not dealing with emails that never go anywhere. Artists who don't want to set up and run an e-store to sell their work. All of a sudden, everything sort of, after you've set up a wallet and bought some cryptocurrency, everything from there on out is just like butter smooth. And the fact that in the same breath, I can start selling some of my artwork, which again, I've never commodified my artwork. It's just not a thing that's in my wheelhouse. It's not a main interest of mine. And it's it's a privilege to not have to worry about that because
Right.
I'm getting
Oh,
paid
sure.
as a
Right.
teacher.
Yeah.
And
Right.
but and so then like I'm making more money that I spend on other artworks, and it's been like a beautiful sense of finally having an exchange with artists and a multinational sense of artists that I've just never been able to do before. And so to me, being able to support artists in a very real way at all levels and really easily, like that's amazing. That's amazing.
But it also makes me curious about the experience of being a collector, right? Because now the opportunity to get stuff is made, as you said, butter smooth. But how do you enjoy it? I mean, looking at the equivalent of a wallet of your collected items, is, other than from an attainment standpoint, there's, that's not the key. How do you enjoy the content that you purchased?
It's a super important question, and Lale comes down and asks me, every week, like, when are you when are you gonna make a thing so we can enjoy the 2,000 things that you've
Oh,
bought?
right.
You know? And simultaneously, it's a problem that I've been dealing with for, again, 5 or 6 years, buying video art on platforms like Sedition, Data Editions. We have a whole bunch of the infinite objects, little
Oh, yeah,
micro
right.
screens that are really beautiful, but they don't have any audio. So it's an ongoing problem for like all digital art. I think there are people who are spinning up screens where you basically give it your wallet and it downloads all the things and then just shows them to you. But there's a number of problems. One of which is like I actually really love to collect interactive works and WebGL based works. It's not as easy to show those as it is a JPEG or and then I'm collecting a lot of generative works as well. This piece on the wall behind me is a Kim Assendorf, and it's all shaders. It's running right now, and it's different every time you load it up. And so that's running on an old laptop that we have. I think it's a big challenge that hasn't been solved yet really well, is how to enjoy those in your daily life. They're a little bit too much commodity right now, and not
Right.
not enough art that you enjoy.
Yeah, okay. Well, that helps. That all makes sense. But also, it rings another bell for me, which is kind of a bell that rings for me in so many variations of digital art, which is if you go beyond the most basic things. So if you go beyond GIFs or JPEGs or WAV files or MP3s, and you get into things like generative stuff, shaders, WebGL tools, and stuff like that, it's dependent on that technology still being there. And all of a sudden, we're starting to see things like, what actually becomes of shaders as some of those technologies start to get to be eclipsed, or
Mhm.
even as something as standardized as OpenGL starts going through multiple revisions of change, and all of a sudden you have an artwork that's dependent upon deprecated technology. This is a problem as old as Namjoon Pike, right?
Right.
But isn't that kind of exacerbated by the NFT opportunity?
Yeah, for sure. And, I think again, that's some of why I said that, it feels a little bit more leaning towards art as a commodity
Right.
that's meant to be traded than it does as art as meant to be collected. There are a lot of higher level discussions going on around like, okay, make sure you download all of your NFT files and you've got them on hard drive, and you're thinking about how you're going to assure that those work into the future. I think I'll give you like one of the side things, which is a lot of the works that I have certain works that I'm going to have printed, and that's going to be one of the ways that they're archived. I have some works like this one behind me, which I do want to actually make a little dedicated microcomputer that just plays that artwork, and that's all it does. And then a lot of works are going to die.
Yeah.
and and
Well,
in the same way, like I'm okay with my work ceasing to exist. Like I'm okay with parts of my collection ceasing to exist as well. Like I don't know that all culture needs to be survive forever. I'm a little less of the keep everything all the time. That seems weird to me. But I understand that there are aspects of what we're doing that do need to survive and exist into the future so that like we're understood. I think history is more complex than save all the things.
right. Yeah. Yeah. That's well, especially since, at one point saving all the things was maybe a reasonable thing to do
Right.
because we weren't obsessive with generating things, right?
Right.
now, now we absolutely are, and it's imperative for us to figure out how to throw away things.
Yeah.
You just hear about the numbers of videos that are uploaded to YouTube or images that are uploaded to Facebook, and you're like, oh yeah, we have to learn how to throw away shit. Right?
Yeah, we really do.
That's funny. So I appreciate you helping me out. Now, again, in terms of the technology that can be embedded or can be minted into an NFT, there's no limits. I could just do like an album and turn it into an NFT or a sound art thing. I mean, the main limitation, it has to be purely digital in some fashion, right?
Yeah, and people are doing that. And in fact, you can like pre-mint a new project of 1,000 pieces by Telefon Tel Aviv starting next week.
Oh, okay.
Like
Nice.
he's getting into it and has spun up a really interesting website. I saw that you interviewed him
Yeah.
really early on.
Yeah,
But
he's gotten to be a good friend, yeah.
yeah, so
But
you should check that project out. It's interesting.
yeah, I'm gonna have to poke him about that. He can give me an education. That's
But yeah,
easy.
and I've seen some really beautiful. I've got some really beautiful generative audio pieces, and then I've got some pieces that function more as just an album, and it's got it's got the picture for the track,
Right.
and it's got a little audio player, and it's all HTML based, and you can download the MP3 and load it into your music player on your phone if you want.
Well, I'm particularly interested though in the idea of generative work because this is another thing I feel like when I think about you, you've always kind of gravitated towards generative things or things where you set a system up and then view and maybe tweak its output, but it's a generative system. How do you do a generative piece in this NFT world, and again have it so it's going to survive? I mean, can you do something like a processing sketch or a PD or a max patch, or does it have to be an HTML based thing? Or I mean, to what extent can you just have a bunch of code? I mean, obviously, if you can have shaders, there's some way to like have it be code based. But I'm curious, how does that happen? And again, how as the collector do you get to play it?
Yeah, so it's different per platform. The platform that I prefer is in the sort of Tezos space, and they basically allow you to upload.
I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah,
Tezo space.
sorry,
Thanks.
Tezos is one of the blockchains. So you're probably
Okay.
familiar with like Bitcoin and
Right. Right.
Ethereum, and so Tezos is a let's call it clean NFT. It's a proof of stake versus proof of work. So
Oh,
it's
okay.
it's about 1,000th as ecologically damaging or energy consuming as Ethereum.
Okay, so I'm already more interested because that's one of the biggest issues I have with crypto in general. And so this
Yeah.
is very interesting to hear. Okay, great. Continue.
Yeah. So the Tezos blockchain friendlier and a lot more experimental, and that's where I tend to play. And essentially, yeah, there's templates that you can use, but at the end of the day, it's kind of like what can you run in an iframe.
Oh,
So
okay.
anything that you can manage to run in an iframe for an HTML page will run on most of the platforms that I use. And so, yeah, I think some people are doing generative stuff with as simple as P5, but I suspect there's other JavaScript libraries and such that are doing other kinds of generative audio. I don't know if somebody's got something running from PD to an iframe. It's a good question.
I didn't think that a shader could run in an iframe. How does
But
that
a
happen?
shader can run on a website, like it, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
And you can run shaders just through P5 even if you want.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Somehow whenever we start talking about shaders, all of a sudden my mind goes to a very different place, and it doesn't
Right.
have to be right. So I appreciate that. So one of the interesting things is that by having, working on kind of this virtual stuff, all that stuff is kind of immune to the hellhole that is COVID, right? So, yay.
Right.
But an awful lot of the artwork that you've done, the art that you've been involved in, things that I've seen that you and Lale have worked on together have been physical pieces that live in the real world that are visited by groups of people walking through a singular place. How has the monkey of COVID affected that?
Yeah, we literally gave an artist talk last week, and we were showing our unclaimed piece, which is where you blow across this small city and your breath is repeated across hundreds of fans underneath a giant sheet of plastic. And so it like invigorated your breath or like recreated your breath as an atmosphere. And the whole point was that multiple people would be blowing across the table at each other.
Poor choice.
And like that piece used to be like so beautiful, like we're all mixing and breathing the same air. Isn't that wonderful? And like now watching the footage, you're just like, oh my God. So yeah, I think thinking about participatory art has become a different thing. I think one of the nice pieces is that at the same time that participatory is having to mean less about breathing on each other and touching the same things as other people, the technology for doing much better body tracking and interesting body tracking has improved with some of the machine learning. I'm getting ready to teach a class on that this spring, just because I think there are new ways that you can engage the body in more subtle ways that aren't just jumping jack, magic mirror kind of artwork. And so I'm interested in like how that opens up new pathways for engagement that are still COVID safe, maybe.
Yeah, well, that sounds good because I'll tell you, one of the fears that I've recently had and talking with some other artists, it kind of confirmed my fears, which is that an awful lot of art that people are being asked to perform is sort of like, don't do anything close. If you want to shoot it across the side of the building, that's awesome. If you want to cover a 20-story building with art, go nuts. Just don't come within 6 feet. And it's like there's a whole lot of art, whether it's performative art or collaborative art things or just interactive art pieces where you're going to eventually end up sharing that button that you press or whatever. That it feels like those are compromised in a very vital and scary way, and I don't know how we come out of that.
I don't either. I know that in some ways Meow Wolf, like as a project that's very physical and very
Imagine.
spatial, like I think they've pushed through it and just said like, you know what, like you sign the waiver and we space people out and wipe things down, and that's it is what it is. And I think because the very essence of their work is sort of embodied space
And touching
and
stuff.
and
Yeah.
physicality.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're going to get back to that. I think it is interesting that like a lot of COVID has stopped being about whether or not you're touching something, and it's really just more about whether or not you're breathing on someone.
Right.
And I think that's going to continue to unpack and allow physicality to come back in some interesting ways. Yeah, we're so much more aware of how close we are to other humans and who gets permission to come into our bubble now. It's pretty insane.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that idea of going back and looking at footage of how we used to act, crazy.
But we're all hungry and we ask permission to get hugs. Like
Yeah.
we're ready to be there with people and give them hugs again.
Sometimes. Depends who you are.
But that's what I mean. That's what I mean. Like when you meet someone you care about, right? Like you're ready for that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Chris, we have long run out of time. I blew right past my my fail-safe moment there, and so we're going to have to bail. But before we go, Is there anything that you're working on right now that's new and interesting that you would keep people into?
Oh
Because
goodness.
you're my cool seeker. So, what's something you've run across recently that caught your eye?
I love what Casey Reese is doing on the Feral File NFT platform. And I know it's an NFT platform, but it's full of really interesting art and it's very thoughtfully curated. And the next show that's coming up at the end of the month is everything that you buy as an NFT also comes with a plotter, like a physical piece. So it's a nice entryway if you can't decide if you just want to be non-fungible. Um, I think that's one of the things I'm thinking most about. And then the Interdependence podcast from Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst has just been blowing my mind with the way that they're pushing and exploring really future forward notions of digital primacy, physical primacy. What does it mean to have new kinds of economies? That podcast blows my mind every week. So
Awesome, great. Hey man, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and have a good one.
thank you. You too, Darwin.
Many thanks to Chris Coleman for having the great chat. I miss some of the people from Denver so much, and he is definitely one of those people. I want to thank you all for listening. Thanks for those of you who are supporting me on Patreon. If you want to help support the podcast and the transcriptions and all that stuff, you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/Darwin Gross, DARWIN GROSSE. And even if you don't become a patron, please follow me there because I do occasional blog posts about stuff that catches my fancy or stuff that I find interesting or stuff that I find infuriating. So if you're interested in any of those things, please follow me on Patreon. Otherwise, I want to thank you for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, shoot me a note. ddg@cycling74.com or darwin.gross@gmail.com will do it. With that, I want to thank you so much. We'll catch you later. Bye.